It began with a simple tip. Whispers carried on the wind of something terrible hidden beneath the dry, cracked earth of Tamaulipas. A local man, whose face will never be known, whose name will never be spoken, stepped forward with a quiet urgency. He didn't say much, just enough to set everything in motion. He spoke of people disappearing, of buses never reaching their destination, of a silence that had fallen over the land like a death shroud. The authorities arrived hesitantly. They had been here before, too many times, always knowing what they would find, yet never fully prepared to face it. A group of heavily armed federal agents, forensic experts, and local police officers made their way to a desolate ranch outside of San Fernando. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, dry and lifeless, the kind of place that swallows secrets whole. There were no signs of life, only the rusted remains of vehicles long abandoned, their windows shattered, their tires deflated, their owners nowhere to be found. The first grave was shallow. A single boot protruded from the loose dirt, the leather cracked from the relentless sun. The officers stood still for a moment, exchanging glances, knowing exactly what lay beneath. They began to dig, shovels piercing the soil, revealing a nightmare that had been hidden in plain sight. The body was that of a man, his hands bound behind his back, a bullet hole clean through the center of his forehead. His face was frozen in a grimace of agony, his clothes stiff with dried blood. Then came the second grave, and the third, and the fourth, each one more horrifying than the last. Within hours, the number of uncovered bodies had reached double digits. Some were stripped of clothing, others mutilated beyond recognition. Many bore marks of extreme torture, fingernails pried from their beds, deep lacerations carved into their flesh, bones shattered from blunt force trauma. Some victims had been decapitated, their heads missing, never to be found. The stench of decomposition thickened the air, an unholy mix of rot and dirt and death. Even the most hardened officers gagged, some stepping away to empty their stomachs behind the skeletal remains of what had once been a family sedan. The forensic teams worked tirelessly, cataloging each body, every piece of evidence, every fragment of bone, every bullet casing buried in the soil. But they were barely scratching the surface. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. Officials tried to keep it quiet, but it was impossible. Reporters began arriving, their cameras capturing the slow, methodical exhumation of what was quickly becoming one of the largest mass graves in Mexico's history. The people of San Fernando had always known that something was wrong, but the scale of the carnage left them speechless. It wasn't long before the truth began to unravel. Survivors came forward, their voices trembling as they recounted the horrors they had witnessed. Bus passengers pulled from their seats at makeshift checkpoints, forced into the back of cartel trucks, never seen again. Entire families dragged from their homes in the dead of night, their fates sealed the moment the knock came at their door. Travelers trying to reach the U.S. border, stopped, interrogated, and executed on the spot for refusing to join the ranks of Los Zetas. The numbers climbed, first 72, then 145, then 193. The digging continued, and with every shovelful of dirt lifted from the ground, another life lost was revealed. And yet, for all the bodies they uncovered, they knew there were more. So many more. The story of the San Fernando mass graves was not just one of murder. It was one of absolute control, of a cartel that operated with military precision, of a region so deeply corrupted that death had become routine. The local police were useless at best, complicit at worst. The government's response was slow, hesitant, as if unsure how much it was willing to expose. And the people? The people had no choice but to live in fear, their voices strangled by the same silence that had allowed these killings to continue unchecked for so long. For years, the roads leading into San Fernando had been cursed. Travelers passed through quickly, never stopping, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Those who dared to pause, who lingered too long or took the wrong turn, vanished, and the land, ever patient, swallowed them whole. The first mass grave was just the beginning. The nightmare was far from over. Long before the mass graves of San Fernando were uncovered, the name Los Zetas was already synonymous with terror. They weren't like other cartels. They weren't just traffickers or street-level criminals looking for quick profits. They were soldiers, highly trained, disciplined, and utterly merciless. Unlike the older, more traditional cartels that relied on bribery and alliances to secure their power, Los Zetas built their empire on blood and fear. Their origins can be traced back to the late 1990s, when a group of elite Mexican military commandos defected from the army. These men, trained in counterinsurgency, guerrilla warfare, and advanced interrogation techniques, were recruited by the Gulf Cartel to serve as their enforcers. They brought with them tactics the criminal underworld had never seen before: precision assassinations, ambush strategies, and battlefield-level brutality. They were efficient, they were disciplined, and soon they realized they didn't need to take orders from anyone. By the early 2000s, Los Zetas had broken away from the Gulf Cartel, carving their own bloody path through Mexico. They established a new order, one based not just on drug trafficking, but on absolute dominance. Extortion, human trafficking, kidnapping, arms smuggling, nothing was off limits. Their ranks swelled as they recruited former military and law enforcement officers, training them in the ways of war. And those who refused to join? They were eliminated, often in ways designed to send a message. The violence escalated quickly. Towns that had once been safe became killing fields overnight. Police stations were attacked with military-grade weapons. Political candidates were assassinated in broad daylight. In cities under their control, banners, narcomantas were hung from bridges, warning anyone who dared to oppose them. Their enemies weren't just rival cartels, but civilians, journalists, politicians, anyone who stood in their way. What set Los Zetas apart was their sheer brutality. They didn't just kill, they made a spectacle of it. Beheadings were recorded and uploaded to the internet. Victims were burned alive in barrels of oil, their screams echoing into the night. Entire buses of people were taken, their passengers forced into fights to the death, the survivors conscripted into the cartel, the losers buried in unmarked graves. By 2010, Los Zetas had expanded their influence across Mexico, controlling vast territories in Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, Coahuila, and Veracruz. They had a presence in Central America and deep connections in the United States, smuggling drugs, weapons, and people across the border with ease. The authorities were outmatched, underfunded, outgunned, and often unwilling to confront the cartel's wrath. It was in this era of unchecked power that Los Zetas turned San Fernando into one of their many strongholds. The town became a living nightmare, where entire neighborhoods fell silent, where buses disappeared into the darkness, where bodies surfaced only when the cartel allowed them to be found. The police, the government, the people, no one could stop them. And so, the killing continued. The first signs of horror were easy to overlook. Missing persons reports that, when ignored, whispered stories of travelers vanishing along the highway, buses that departed but never arrived. San Fernando, a small town in Tamaulipas, was never supposed to be the center of a nightmare. It was just another stop along the road to the U.S. border, a place migrants passed through on their way to what they hoped would be a better life. But for many, that journey ended here. Los Zetas had turned San Fernando into a hunting ground. The highways leading into town were under their control, with checkpoints disguised as routine police stops. Armed men in stolen uniforms waved down buses and trucks, searching for people who could be of use to the cartel, or those who simply had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. At first, the passengers were questioned. Where are you going? Who sent you? Do you have money? But the real purpose was clear: to find new recruits, force them into cartel service, and dispose of those who refused. What happened next was beyond comprehension. Passengers were pulled from their seats at gunpoint, lined up along the roadside like cattle waiting for slaughter. Some were forced into nearby vehicles, driven deep into the rural outskirts of town, where abandoned ranches and farmland served as execution sites. The buses themselves were sometimes found days later, abandoned, with only bloodstains and bullet holes left behind. Those who resisted were killed on the spot. Others were taken to cartel compounds, where they were given an ultimatum: fight, join, or die. Many were given weapons and forced to participate in gruesome death matches, pitted against fellow captives in battles to the death. The survivors were absorbed into Los Zetas, their initiation sealed with the blood of those they had killed. The rest were discarded, their bodies left in mass graves that would remain undiscovered for months, sometimes years. Migrants were especially vulnerable. Traveling alone, with no connections, no way to alert anyone if they went missing, they became easy targets. They were kidnapped by the dozens, taken to isolated ranches, and slaughtered without hesitation. Some were shot execution style, while others were tortured for sport. It didn't matter if they had families waiting for them across the border. To Los Zetas, they were nothing more than disposable bodies, warnings to anyone who thought they could defy cartel rule. In August 2010, the world caught its first glimpse of the atrocities taking place in San Fernando. Mexican authorities, acting on a rare tip, raided a ranch outside the town and made a gruesome discovery: 72 bodies, all migrants from Central and South America. They had been blindfolded, bound, and shot at close range. The only survivor, a young Ecuadorian man, had managed to escape by playing dead. His story was chilling. The migrants had been captured, offered a chance to work for the cartel, and when they refused, they were executed one by one. The news sent shockwaves across Mexico and beyond, but it was only the beginning. The full scale of the horror would not be uncovered until the following year, when a second, even more horrifying discovery was made. A network of mass graves containing nearly 200 bodies, buried in shallow pits across multiple locations in San Fernando. Los Zetas had turned this town into a slaughterhouse, and for years no one had been able to stop them. It started as a trickle, one bus vanishing here, another there. At first, the disappearances seemed random, easy to dismiss as isolated incidents in a country where violence had become routine. But as time passed, patterns emerged. Passenger buses traveling along Federal Highway 101, the main route from the south to the U.S. border, were simply disappearing. Not one or two, but dozens. Families waited for their loved ones to call from their destination, but the calls never came. Bus companies, fearing the consequences, downplayed the incidents, blaming scheduling errors, road conditions, or mechanical failures. But the truth was far more sinister. The buses weren't breaking down. They were being stopped, commandeered by armed men at cartel checkpoints, their passengers dragged out and taken into the darkness. Los Zetas had perfected their operation. Their men, often disguised as police or soldiers, would set up roadblocks outside of San Fernando, waving down buses with the confidence of authority. The drivers, knowing the price of resistance, had no choice but to comply. Once the passengers were offloaded, the real horror began. The process was brutal, methodical. The cartel members separated the men from the women. Those who looked strong, young, or capable of handling a weapon were given a choice: join or die. Some were beaten into submission, others forced into gladiator-style fights, where the winner earned the privilege of becoming a cartel soldier. The losers? Their bodies were dumped into the mass graves that would later be discovered. Women and children were dealt with in ways too gruesome to fully comprehend. Many were never seen again. Those who survived long enough to speak later told stories of unspeakable cruelty, of rape, of slavery, of lives stolen in the most horrific ways imaginable. It was a system, a conveyor belt of death, moving passengers from the highway into the hands of the cartel, where their fate was sealed before their families even realized they were missing. For months, authorities did nothing. Local police were either complicit or too terrified to intervene. The government, already overwhelmed by cartel violence, hesitated, reluctant to admit that entire busloads of people were vanishing under their watch. But the truth could not stay buried forever. In April 2011, federal forces, under mounting pressure, raided several cartel strongholds in San Fernando. What they found defied imagination. In abandoned ranches, shallow pits held the remains of over 190 people, most of them victims of the bus kidnappings. Some still had their wrists bound, their bodies left where they fell. Others had been reduced to nothing more than scattered bones, the desert reclaiming what was left of them. The discovery made international headlines. News outlets ran images of forensic teams digging through the dirt, pulling body after body from the earth. Families across Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador frantically searched for the names of their missing loved ones, hoping against hope that they were not among the dead. But for most, there would be no answers. Only silence. Even after the mass graves were uncovered, the buses kept disappearing. The killings did not stop. The people of Tamaulipas knew that the government's intervention was temporary, that the soldiers and forensic teams would eventually leave, and that when they did, Los Zetas would return, stronger than before. In San Fernando, the road was still ruled by the cartel, and for many who traveled it, there would be no journey's end. San Fernando was not a battlefield. There were no constant shootouts, no city-wide clashes between rival cartels, no dramatic standoffs with law enforcement. And yet, it was a town completely under the grip of terror. The streets were quiet, but not with peace, with fear. A fear so absolute, so suffocating, that people had learned to move, speak, and even breathe in ways that would not attract attention. The cartel didn't need to march through the town with rifles in hand. Their power was already woven into every part of life. Every business, every home, every person existed at their mercy. Store owners paid quotas or disappeared. Farmers surrendered portions of their harvest, knowing refusal meant their entire family would be slaughtered. Teachers avoided eye contact with certain students, knowing that even children, especially children, were recruited as spies for the cartel. The police? They were useless. Some officers worked directly for Los Zetas, tipping them off to federal raids, escorting cartel leaders through the streets, or worse, delivering victims into their hands. Others, those who still clung to the idea of duty, were powerless. Those who spoke out were killed. Those who resisted were found dismembered in roadside ditches, their bodies accompanied by narcomantas, banners explaining in brutal detail what happened to those who defied the Zetas. San Fernando's silence was not a sign of normalcy. It was a warning. The people learned to look away when men in trucks rolled through town. They learned to ignore the sounds of screams coming from abandoned buildings. If someone went missing, they didn't ask questions. To speak of the disappeared was to risk disappearing yourself. Everyone knew where the bodies were buried. They knew of the ranches outside town, where the ground had been disturbed too many times. They knew of the buses that never reached their destinations. But they also knew that acknowledging these horrors meant inviting them into their own lives. So they stayed quiet. Even the churches offered no refuge. Priests who dared to denounce the violence were killed, their churches defiled. Journalists who tried to expose the truth either fled or were silenced. Entire families left in the dead of night, abandoning their homes, their livelihoods, everything they had, because staying meant death. And so, San Fernando became a ghost town in plain sight. Shops operated, schools remained open, people walked the streets, but it was all an illusion. Beneath the surface, the town was already dead. It was a place where fear had taken root so deeply that it dictated every movement, every decision, every breath. Because in San Fernando, Los Zetas were not just the law. They were the only law. The first reports came from whispers, anonymous tips, hushed conversations between those who had seen too much. Something terrible lay beneath the earth outside San Fernando. Something that had been growing for years, hidden in the dry soil of Tamaulipas. But the people of San Fernando had learned not to speak too loudly, not to attract attention. The price of knowing too much was death. It wasn't until April 2011 that the truth could no longer be ignored. Acting on intelligence reports, federal forces and investigative teams descended upon the outskirts of San Fernando, targeting abandoned ranches, empty fields, and isolated dirt roads. What they found was beyond horror. The first mass grave contained 59 bodies. Then another with 43, another with 23. By the time the last pit was uncovered, the total had risen to nearly 200 corpses, men, women, and even teenagers, all buried in shallow, hurried graves. Some still had their hands tied. Others bore the marks of brutal beatings, shattered bones, and gunshot wounds at point-blank range. Some had been dismembered. Many had been left there for months, their remains barely distinguishable from the earth that covered them. Investigators quickly realized that these were not just random victims of cartel violence. These were the missing passengers from the buses, the travelers who had been plucked off the highways by Los Zetas and led to their deaths. Some had been executed immediately, shot and dumped into the ground like discarded trash. Others had been forced to fight in gladiator-style death matches, pitted against one another for the sick amusement of the cartel. The survivors of those matches had been given a grim reward: forced recruitment into the Zetas, their initiation marked by the blood of their fellow captives. The discovery of the graves sent shockwaves across Mexico and beyond. News stations broadcast images of forensic teams digging through the earth, pulling body after body from the dirt. Families from across Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala flooded morgues and police stations, desperate for news of their missing loved ones. Most would never receive closure. The bodies had been left in the ground for so long, decomposing in the sweltering heat that many were unrecognizable. DNA tests would take months, if they were even possible. Even as the mass graves were being unearthed, the message from Los Zetas was clear. They were still in control. The cartel responded with a fresh wave of terror. More bodies left on roadsides, more threats scrawled onto banners and hung from bridges. The discovery of the graves had not weakened them. It had only made them angrier. Despite the horror uncovered in San Fernando, despite the international outcry, despite the government's promises to bring justice, nothing truly changed. The soldiers eventually left. The investigators moved on to the next crime scene, and the people of San Fernando? They remained trapped, knowing that even beneath the exposed graves, the earth still held more secrets, more bodies, more victims. Because in a land ruled by Los Zetas, death was never a discovery, it was only a reminder. The bodies in the ground told one part of the story. But there were others, few scattered barely alive, who had seen everything and lived to tell it. Survivors were rare. Los Zetas were meticulous, ensuring that no witnesses remained. But every now and then, someone slipped through the cracks. Someone crawled out of a grave they weren't meant to escape. One such survivor was a man from Ecuador, who later became the only known witness to the first massacre of 72 migrants in 2010. He had been traveling north, packed into a truck with others who, like him, dreamed of a life beyond Mexico's deadly highways. But their journey ended in San Fernando. The truck was stopped. Armed men pulled them out one by one. They were taken to an abandoned ranch where they were lined up and given a choice: work for Los Zetas or die. When they refused, the executions began. The survivor watched as his fellow travelers were shot in the head, their bodies collapsing in the dirt. One after another, the men fell. The women screamed. He was shot as well, but the bullet only grazed his head. He played dead, lying motionless among the corpses as the killers laughed, finishing off anyone who showed signs of life. When night fell and the Zetas left, he crawled through the darkness, bleeding, starving, barely able to walk. He found help miles away and was eventually rescued by authorities. His testimony shocked the world, but it did little to stop the machine of death that was already in motion. The killings continued. The bus kidnappings escalated. More mass graves were filled, more people vanished. But his story wasn't the only one. Another survivor, a man who had been kidnapped in 2011, later described the horrifying reality of being taken by Los Zetas. He had been traveling from southern Mexico, hoping to cross into the U.S. He never made it past San Fernando. His bus was stopped. The passengers were forced into trucks and driven to a ranch where the killings took place. Some were shot immediately. Others were thrown into pits while still alive, their screams muffled by the dirt shoveled over them. He was one of the few chosen to fight. Given a crude weapon, he was forced to kill another captive in front of his captors. If he refused, he would have been executed himself. He fought, barely surviving, and was taken into cartel service, but he never truly belonged. One night, after months of working under constant threats, he escaped, running through the fields like an animal, hiding in rivers and caves until he reached safety. But safety was relative. Survivors of Los Zetas carried more than just physical wounds. They were marked men, their names added to the cartel's endless list of enemies. Some were hunted down. Others fled the country, knowing they could never truly escape. And for every survivor who spoke out, there were dozens, hundreds, who never could. Because in San Fernando, silence was the only guarantee of survival. The mass graves were undeniable. The testimonies of the few survivors could not be ignored. The entire world had seen the horrors unfolding in San Fernando. And yet, for years, the Mexican government's response was defined not by action, but by silence. It wasn't that they didn't know. They knew. Officials at every level, from local police chiefs to high-ranking federal authorities, had been aware of what was happening. Reports of missing persons had flooded government offices for years. Families had pleaded for investigations only to be met with bureaucratic indifference. Journalists had risked their lives to expose the atrocities, but their stories were buried, their voices silenced. There was no mystery to solve. The truth was an open wound, festering in the heart of Tamaulipas. The buses that never arrived, the families that disappeared overnight, the ranches where the stench of death lingered long after the bodies were gone. Everyone knew who was responsible. But knowing was different from acting. At the local level, police and officials were either too afraid or too involved to intervene. Some worked directly with Los Zetas, ensuring that their operations ran smoothly. They provided intelligence, covered up evidence, and when necessary, delivered victims themselves. Others, those who still believed in the law, faced impossible choices, either obey the cartel or end up in one of their mass graves. At the state level, politicians offered empty words. Publicly, they condemned the violence. Privately, they did nothing. Elections came and went, and each new administration promised security, stability, and end to the bloodshed. But the killings continued, and the graves kept filling. Even the federal government, with its army, its intelligence agencies, its vast resources, failed to act decisively. Occasionally, they sent soldiers into Tamaulipas, launching high-profile raids that resulted in a few arrests. They dismantled some safe houses, seized some weapons, and declared victory. But the victories were hollow. The soldiers left, and Los Zetas returned, stronger than before. The people of San Fernando learned not to trust anyone. To report a crime was to risk death. To speak to the police was to invite retribution. Journalists who dug too deep either vanished or were found mutilated, their bodies left as warnings. And so the silence continued. Not just the silence of the people, but the silence of the state. The government's greatest crime was not complicity, though there was plenty of that. It was apathy. It was the decision, conscious or not, to allow places like San Fernando to become killing fields, to let Los Zetas operate unchecked, knowing that the bodies would eventually be buried, that the news cycle would move on, that the world would forget. But the families never forgot. The mothers who waited for their missing sons, the children who grew up without fathers, the refugees who fled their homes with nothing but the clothes on their backs, they carried the weight of that silence. And in the quiet streets of San Fernando, where the ghosts of the disappeared still lingered, one truth remained. Silence was not just the absence of sound. It was the sound of complicity. It was the sound of a country that had learned to live with horror. In a country where speaking the truth was a death sentence, few dared to expose the horrors of San Fernando. But some did, and they paid for it with their lives. Journalists in Mexico had long been targets, but in Tamaulipas, the risks were absolute. Los Zetas didn't issue warnings. They didn't give second chances. If a reporter stepped out of line, they simply disappeared. The message was clear. Write what we allow, or don't write at all. The local newspapers knew this too well. By the time the first mass graves were discovered in 2011, most of Tamaulipas' independent journalists had already been silenced. Some had fled. Others had been executed in gruesome fashion, their bodies dumped in public places, their deaths serving as a lesson to anyone else who might be thinking of investigating the cartel's activities. In Nuevo Laredo, a journalist known as Maria del Rosario Fuentes Rubio ran an anonymous Twitter account exposing cartel movements, warning citizens of danger, and sharing reports that local newspapers were too terrified to print. She knew the risks. Everyone did. But she believed the truth had to be told. Then, in 2014, she vanished. Her final tweets were chilling. "Help, they found me." Minutes later, cartel members posted photos from her own phone, one showing her alive, beaten, and terrified, and another showing her dead. They had forced her to type her own final words before executing her. Her crime? Informing the public. She was not the only one. In Reynosa, reporter Valentin Valdez was abducted in 2010 after publishing an article on drug trafficking. His tortured body was dumped in front of a local motel with a note that read, "This is what happens to those who talk too much." Entire newsrooms were forced into silence. Newspapers in cities like Matamoros and Ciudad Victoria stopped reporting on cartel violence altogether. When Los Zetas controlled the streets, they also controlled the headlines. Any coverage of killings, kidnappings, or mass graves had to be approved, or else. Some journalists tried to continue their work from exile, publishing under pseudonyms or leaking information to international media. But even that was dangerous. Los Zetas had eyes everywhere, and their reach extended far beyond Mexico's borders. The murder of journalists wasn't just an attack on individuals, it was an attack on the truth itself. Without reporters to document the atrocities, San Fernando became a black hole of information. The world only saw glimpses of what happened there, the full scale of the horror hidden beneath layers of fear, corruption, and bloodshed. And so the silence deepened. The people of Tamaulipas learned that the only safe way to speak was to say nothing at all. The journalists who had tried to break that silence were gone, their voices erased, their stories unfinished. But the truth never truly disappears. It lingers in whispers, in the memories of those who lived through it, in the unmarked graves that still wait to be uncovered. And somewhere, in the dark corners of San Fernando, there were still those who remembered. For every body unearthed from the mass graves, there was a family still waiting for answers. Mothers, fathers, brothers, and children who had spent years searching, hoping, pleading for any trace of their missing loved ones. In a country where disappearances had become routine, they refused to accept silence. But demanding justice in Tamaulipas was a dangerous act. The families of the missing were forced to become investigators themselves, tracking their loved ones' last known locations, cross-referencing missing person reports, and even digging through the earth with their own hands. They knew the authorities would do little. They had seen the police ignore their pleas, mock their desperation, and in some cases work directly with the very cartels responsible. Many of the disappeared had been migrants, men and women from Central America who had left everything behind to seek a better life. They had boarded buses, heading north with dreams of reaching the U.S., only to vanish somewhere along the way. The families of these migrants faced an even harsher reality. They were not only searching in a foreign land, but in one where their voices carried no weight. They had no political connections, no money, no influence. They had nothing but their grief and determination. Despite the risks, some families banded together, forming collectives to demand answers. Groups like Los Rastreadores, the Trackers, became known for scouring the countryside, looking for clandestine graves, guided only by anonymous tips and their own intuition. With shovels and bare hands, they dug through the dirt, praying for closure, even as they feared what they would find. Others took their fight to the capital, marching in Mexico City with photos of their missing sons and daughters held high. They chanted their names, pleaded for recognition, for justice. But time and time again, they were met with indifference. Government officials nodded solemnly, promised investigations, held press conferences, and then did nothing. Some families faced direct threats for refusing to stay silent. There were stories of mothers who disappeared while searching for their children, of fathers who were executed for asking too many questions. The message from Los Zetas was clear. The dead belonged to the dead. Stop looking. But they couldn't stop, not when their sons and daughters had been stolen from them, not when they knew their loved ones were lying somewhere beneath the soil, waiting to be found. And so they kept searching. Even as the world moved on, even as the authorities turned away, even as the graves continued to swallow more and more victims. For these families, there was no closure, only the endless, agonizing hope that one day they might bring their loved ones home, even if that meant digging through the dirt themselves. The highway through Tamaulipas was a lifeline for many, a road stretching toward the border, carrying passengers dreaming of a better life. But for the bus drivers who traveled this route, it was a path lined with fear. They knew the risks. They knew that not every bus that left its station would arrive at its destination. Some drivers never returned. Some simply disappeared, their routes swallowed by the same silence that claimed their passengers. Others were found dead, their bodies left as warnings to those who might think about speaking out. The ones who survived learned the rules. When armed men flagged you down, you stopped. You opened the doors. You kept your eyes down and your mouth shut. You never asked questions. You never looked at the faces of the people being taken. If you were lucky, they would leave you behind, let you continue your route as if nothing had happened. If you were unlucky, you became cargo, just like the passengers. In the months leading up to the discovery of the San Fernando mass graves, the disappearances of entire busloads of people became more and more frequent. The pattern was undeniable. First, the buses were stopped at impromptu checkpoints set up by Los Zetas. Armed men would board, scanning the passengers, selecting those who fit their needs. Young men to be forced into cartel service, young women to be trafficked, or worse. Sometimes they took everyone. Sometimes they simply executed those who resisted, leaving bodies on the side of the road as a message to others. The drivers left behind to deliver empty buses were told only one thing: keep driving. Keep quiet. Forget what you saw. Some tried to report the crimes. They went to the authorities, pleading for help, warning that something horrifying was happening on the highways. But nothing was done. The police, either complicit or too terrified to act, dismissed their concerns. A few drivers, unwilling to comply with the silence, turned to journalists, only to be silenced themselves. Others quit their jobs altogether, fleeing the state, knowing that one wrong route, one unlucky encounter, could mean their end. But for every driver who left, another took their place, unaware of the nightmare waiting for them on the road. Those who remained learned to live with the fear. They memorized the locations where buses had vanished. They warned passengers not to travel at night. Some even made quiet arrangements with families, promising to call in case their loved ones never arrived. But there was only so much they could do. Because in Tamaulipas, the highway did not belong to the people. It belonged to Los Zetas. And the road to the border was paved with the dead. Far from the highways, beyond the reach of any law, lay the ranches, isolated patches of land where the missing were taken, where their fates were sealed long before anyone came looking. To outsiders, they looked like ordinary properties, scattered among the vast, empty fields of Tamaulipas. But to those who knew, they were something else entirely. They were killing grounds. It was in these ranches that Los Zetas carried out their worst atrocities. Here, the kidnapped passengers, the stolen migrants, and the unlucky travelers met their end. Some were forced to fight each other for survival, crude weapons thrust into their hands, their lives depending on their ability to kill. Others were lined up in front of pits and shot one by one, their bodies tumbling into the earth like discarded waste. The executioners were efficient. They worked methodically, treating each massacre as routine. A few men would handle the killings. Others would dig the graves. Some victims, those deemed valuable, were spared, but only temporarily. Young men were given an ultimatum: work for Los Zetas or die. Most refused. Their bodies joined the rest. Forensic teams who later uncovered these mass graves described the scale of the violence as unimaginable. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of bodies, buried in shallow pits, their remains showing signs of torture. Some had been decapitated. Others had their hands tied behind their backs, their skulls shattered by gunfire. Burned clothing, shattered bones, scattered remains, evidence of executions carried out with military precision. And yet, for years, these ranches remained hidden in plain sight. The people of San Fernando knew what lay beyond the dirt roads, but they dared not speak. The local police were silent. The authorities ignored the warnings. Until one day in 2011, when a mistake was made. A cartel operative, caught by the military, revealed the location of one such ranch, the place where the missing bus passengers had been taken. When federal agents arrived, they found horror beyond comprehension. More than 190 bodies buried in makeshift graves, decomposing under the scorching sun. It was only then, when the evidence could no longer be denied, that the government was forced to act. Soldiers stormed other suspected locations, unearthing more bodies, more secrets. The world learned of the mass graves of San Fernando. The names of the missing were finally spoken aloud. But for every ranch that was uncovered, there were others that remained untouched. Their secrets still buried beneath the earth. For every victim whose remains were identified, there were dozens who would never be found. And for those who lived near these ranches, who had seen the trucks arriving in the dead of night, who had heard the screams carried by the wind, one truth was inescapable. The land of Tamaulipas was soaked in blood, and the killing had never truly stopped. San Fernando did not become a slaughterhouse overnight. It was not just the work of Los Zetas, nor simply the absence of law. It happened because those in power allowed it to happen. The cartel thrived not just through violence, but through infiltration. Their reach extended beyond the highways, beyond the ranches, beyond the killing fields. It stretched into the very institutions meant to stop them. The police, the government, the military. Many of them were not just bystanders, they were part of the machinery. At the local level, municipal police worked as foot soldiers for Los Zetas. They acted as lookouts, tipping off cartel bosses when federal agents approached. They detained innocent people, handing them over to the executioners. Sometimes, they even joined in the killings themselves. The uniform meant nothing. The badge meant nothing. In Tamaulipas, authority belonged to the highest bidder. At the state level, politicians made deals in the shadows. Elections were won and lost with cartel money. The governor's office, the mayor's, the judicial system, everyone had a price. Some were threatened, forced to cooperate out of fear for their families. Others embraced the corruption willingly, enjoying the wealth and protection that came with cartel alliances. And then there was the military. The institution that should have crushed Los Zetas was, in many ways, responsible for their rise. Many of the cartel's founding members had once been elite soldiers, trained by the very government they would later betray. Their knowledge of warfare, their discipline, their ruthlessness, it all came from their time in the special forces. The government had created them, and now it was powerless to stop them. Even at the federal level, where high-ranking officials made public declarations of war against the cartels, the corruption ran deep. The arrests were selective. Some cartel leaders were taken down, but others were protected. Drug shipments flowed north, untouchable, because the right people had been paid. When the mass graves of San Fernando were uncovered, the government had no choice but to act. Soldiers were deployed. Dozens of arrests were made. Officials gave speeches condemning the violence. But behind closed doors, little changed. The police force in Tamaulipas was disbanded and replaced, only for the new officers to fall under cartel control just as quickly. Corrupt politicians were removed, only for their successors to take the same bribes. For every cartel member arrested, another stepped up to take their place. The cycle was unbreakable, because the system itself was rotten. And so the killings continued. The disappearances continued. The mass graves continued to fill. The only thing that changed was the names of those in power and the lies they told to keep it. In the end, the people of San Fernando understood what the rest of the world failed to grasp. Los Zetas were not an anomaly. They were not an outside force that had invaded the state. They were a product of the system. And the system would never destroy what it helped create. Not everyone taken by Los Zetas died in the mass graves. Some lived, but survival came at a cost. Those who escaped did not return as the same people. The ones who were forced to fight for their lives in blood-soaked fields, the ones who dug graves with their bare hands, the ones who were given a choice, kill or be killed, they walked away. But they were never truly free. Some had been kidnapped and pressed into cartel service, trained in brutality until their humanity had been stripped away. They had been tortured until they no longer resisted, until they obeyed commands without hesitation. Some became executioners themselves, their survival tied to the suffering of others. When the military raids began, some of these recruits fled, vanishing into the shadows, forever haunted by the things they had been forced to do. Others, migrants and civilians, were left alive not out of mercy, but because the cartel knew they posed no threat. They were broken men and women, too afraid to speak, too traumatized to fight back. Many fled San Fernando, erasing their identities, cutting ties with their pasts. Others stayed but lived in silence, carrying the weight of their survival like a curse. There were stories of men who had stumbled back into civilization days after their capture, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow, unable to explain what had happened. They would not speak of the things they had seen, the bodies stacked like cargo, the executions carried out like routine, the faces of those who had begged for their lives. They had survived only because Los Zetas had allowed it, and that knowledge was its own kind of prison. Even years later, after the world learned of the horrors of San Fernando, the survivors remained invisible. No support, no justice, no recognition of what they had endured. They avoided the news. They avoided the roads where their buses had been stopped. They avoided the families of the ones who had not made it out. They had survived, but their lives had been stolen from them all the same. And so they moved through the world as ghosts, alive, but forever haunted. Years have passed since the mass graves of San Fernando were uncovered. The headlines faded, the investigations stalled, and the world moved on. But the wounds remain. The families of the disappeared still search, still dig, still beg for answers that may never come. The survivors still carry their scars, trapped between silence and unbearable memory. And the killing, though it may no longer make international news, has never truly stopped. For every grave that was found, there are others that remain undiscovered. For every victim whose name was spoken, there are countless more who were erased without a trace. The system that allowed this horror to happen, the corruption, the complicity, the impunity, still stands. The story of Los Zetas is not just a story of brutality. It is a warning of what happens when violence becomes a language, when the lines between power and crime disappear, when human lives become currency in a system built on fear. But forgetting is the final victory of those who commit these crimes. That is why stories like this must be told. That is why the victims cannot be left in silence. If you want to see more true crime stories that uncover the dark truths the world tries to ignore, subscribe to this channel, because some stories should never be forgotten.